Welcome to the Hearsay Culture Network. You are listening to R&D with D&D. I'm co-host Dave Levine, and I'm here with co-host Denise Howell. Denise, good to see you again today.
Always good to see you, Dave. Great to be here.
We are excited to have on Professor Jessica Eaglin of Indiana University Bloomington School of Law, and the Harry T. Ice Fellow to discuss a variety of issues around a technology that is getting more and more attention as being used in more and more places. We're talking about artificial intelligence. This technology has been around for quite a while. It's been discussed in science fiction even longer. But now that it's getting integrated into a wide array of areas in our lives, it is high time for there to be a better understanding of its uses, its limitations, and its challenges. Jessica focuses on a particularly important area involving algorithmic decision making and artificial intelligence, namely criminal justice and sentencing. These kinds of technologies have been used increasingly to automate and to really technologically administer the kinds of very difficult and challenging decisions in criminal law that previously were left to prosecutors, judges, attorneys, and the system more broadly. And one of the areas that we'll be talking about today is sentencing. The sentencing decisions that are made by courts, right, sometimes through negotiation, through pleas, and what have you, are now increasingly being intermediated, being decided by technologies that themselves are created by human beings. And so Jessica's focus on algorithms in criminal sentencing is one of those areas that requires not only a deep understanding, but really quite a bit of thought as to whether these are the kinds of decisions that we want technology and computers to be making, or whether we should be rethinking the role of technology in that space. Professor Eaglin, who's joining us via Zoom today on August 18th, 2022, was counsel in the justice program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. She clerked with Judge Damon Keith for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and was a litigation associate at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett in New York. Jessica, welcome today on R&D and D&D.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So let me start off the discussion with something which is quite different than sentencing in algorithmic decision making in AI. I read an article a few days ago on August 14th in the Register that was titled, "AI Could Save Future Firefighters from Deadly Explosions." The article discusses the use of AI to predict when flashover fires, these combustions of chemicals and what have you, in places where firefighters are located, will occur. Down to apparently the technology could, when it's deployed, allow for a 30-second notice even to firefighters saying, get out of that space. This is, I'm using as an example, and here's my question for you, at the range of areas in which AI is now playing a role. And I'm curious if you could frame the fact that AI is being used simultaneously to predict flashover fires, but it's also involved in something very different, which is deciding the liberty interests of a human being. How should we be thinking about AI writ large as a technology in our lives today?
Yeah, thank you. So I think this is a great example of a common sort of misconception about algorithms and AI in general, which is that we only have one sort of response, AI good, AI bad, right? And it's really much more contextual than that. And just as you sort of raised in your question, AI pops up in lots of different places. I mean, the work that I focus on is primarily thinking about algorithms in the context of criminal laws administration. But when you really simplify it, an algorithm really is just a standardization of predictions. And so, in the context that you were talking about with uh, these flash fires, I mean, that report was talking about how firefighters have long been trying to predict the conditions on which flash fires might occur. And the algorithm is facilitating a potentially more precise, more accurate prediction of something that firefighters have already been trying to do for a long time in their practice. What algorithms do, AI is doing, is bringing together, drawing on large data sets, larger data sets than obviously individuals could assess on their own, to standardize the prediction of particular outcomes that can then inform specific decisions made in different contexts. And so the firefighters that are using or potentially could be using this technology to inform their decisions or inform their firefighting practice would be drawing on much more information than they currently have access to in making their determinations about how to go about their work.
Denise is going to turn us to another use of AI, one that has not gone so far as expected.
Well, and before I even get to what Dave's alluding to here, I want to bring up the topic of chatbots and see, Jessica, if you even really deem a chatbot to be an AI. And for people who don't quite know what a chatbot is, these are things that you may have interacted with without knowing it in a customer service environment. I know whenever I interact with Delta on their secured messaging, there is a chatbot that takes over for the first part of that conversation, and you have to bang on it quite a bit until you get a human as it filters you through its various decision tree questions and matrix there. So what do you think, Jessica? Are these things that we're starting to see in the wild that interact with us that aren't human? Do you consider them driven by AI technically, or are they simply a predictive algorithm, as you were mentioning with firefighters?
Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting. I mean, I think that there are types of artificial intelligence that perhaps rely on more than just the algorithm. The algorithm is sort of the underlying technology in artificial intelligence, but certainly in the context of the chatbots, when you're calling Delta or someplace else, they've got an algorithm that's saying, this person's calling, here are the, options of, based on sort of our past data sets, here are the options of what people most likely are calling about. Right. And so part of what we as users are struggling with is saying like, well, my question is different than the 5 questions that they think I'm probably calling about. I'm not sure how many times that's right. There's sort of this question of how often we really do need the help of the human. But again, I think this point the broader point I'm trying to make is even if we can call all of those, the chatbots as sort of artificial intelligence that relies on algorithms instead of human beings. But we're always really required to ask this question about what is the context in which these technologies are being employed, and for what purpose, and sort of what is the value add and the costs that come along with that decision.
So what do you think of the fact that some companies that have chatbots in development, Meta in particular is in the news at the moment, but Microsoft has been there before with a notorious chatbot it unleashed on Twitter called Tay. And also recently in the news was something internal to Google called Lambda that one of its engineers decided had actually become sentient based on the responses it was getting back to Meta's, which is called BlenderBot 3. Much like Tay, it didn't take much once this was a tool that was available for the public to ask questions of for BlenderBot 3 to reveal that it had already been trained on a lot of highly controversial, inaccurate borderline or beyond borderline racist and all kinds of unpleasant other aspects that were creeping into the discussions that were coming up with BlenderBot 3. But what do you think of these companies just deciding, oh, hey, we're going to put this out there and let people play with it when they know that this is not just something that can happen, but seems to happen more often than not?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many contexts in which, these kinds of technologies are being employed. And there's a real call that's coming, I think, from the public policy space, from the academic space as well, saying, we really need to have some sort of ethics of AI, right? Saying that, just because we can or we have the capacity to use some of these technologies doesn't mean that they should be used in every space for every reason that we can imagine. I'm not, deeply steeped in the context of Meta or these other instances of artificial intelligence that you mentioned, but I think the broader point that you're that your question is getting at is again that just because we have a capacity to use them doesn't mean that we should be using them in every space, and we certainly need some sort of guidance, some sort of rationales for when and why we might employ some of these technologies and for what purpose.
Yeah, I'd especially like us to also have some sort of, in the ethical rubric around these things, disclaimers of, when you're actually dealing with a chatbot as opposed to a human, because they're designed to feel like you're interacting with a human. And then when they start telling you how, who they think is still president and what specific ethnic groups they're not fond of, it's a little jarring.
Yeah.
One question, just to follow up on Denise's questioning there, Jessica. One phrase that Denise referred to as training, and this is a really important part of algorithmic decision making. Can you just educate our listeners for a couple of minutes on how AI is trained, and therefore, to that point, how a technology can within 24 hours start spewing conspiracy theories and things like that?
Again, so I think you're really asking this question with social media in your mind,
or even, and I'm going to be asking about sentencing, even with sentencing. How is, as a general matter, how is AI trained? I mean, I know that we could spend this could be a webinar that would take us months. All right, I understand that. So I'm just going to ask you in 2 minutes to give us a quick overview on how training occurs in the AI context before we turn to sentencing.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, you've got this key component of your data set, right? So you've got to get the data. The data has to be so whatever it is that you're trying to study, you have a question. That question is designed or is formulated by a human. Then you've got your data. That data is sort of observed past behaviors that have been coded by humans to say, for example, this whether somebody has been arrested or not for something means X in this, like it has to mean something, like the computer has to be able to run an analysis on it, and so you code it to say like this person has these characteristics, or they give it meaning basically. And then so you have your question, you've got your data set. Then you design your algorithm. The algorithm, in the case that you're talking about, when you're talking about artificial intelligence, that algorithm is not, in fact, designed by humans, right? The question is, and the outcomes may be, but the algorithm itself can update on its own. So you aren't, I mean, it gets into really technical questions about sort of statistical modeling and things like that. But the sort of simple takeaway is you give the algorithm, like you basically create a model and then you let the algorithm run on its own. So it'll just keep predicting, and it'll update itself as different sort of conditions arise. But the key points that humans are sort of involved in include asking what it is we care about in the first place. What are the data sets on which this algorithm can rely? And sort of, other technical questions, like what are the cutoffs between different questions? Like if you want an algorithm to rank, who's the most likely to engage in certain behavior in the future, you've got to give them cutoffs to say, we don't want to predict everybody as the same. We need differentiation, and humans go ahead and make that differentiation.
Let's turn more specifically to sentencing. And I later on in the interview, I want to ask you about a little bit of writing here. But in light of these decisions, as I mentioned in the introduction, sentencing in the criminal justice system plays a huge role, and it's a controversial area. We're recording on August 18th, 2022. And our former president's counsel has just been sentenced through a plea agreement just today, right, involving 15 counts of tax fraud, and the details are not clear. But he's been sentenced by a judge to a few months in jail, presumably because he's going to be testifying in later prosecutions, right? On the other hand, right, there are other folks probably in the same court who are getting sentenced for crimes that are not comparatively as serious, for far longer jail time, far longer fines because of different situations. AI and algorithmic decision making has played a role here and is playing a role, and you've written about this extensively. And so let me ask you this question in light of what you said to jump into it. We tend to have a kind of colloquial idea that computers by definition are going to be they're going to be dispassionate, and they're going to make decisions based upon information in a rational way, right, that is fair because they're coded to not have human biases. You've written that bias exists in algorithms, notwithstanding that. But the really, I think, challenging question, which plays a role here, is whether AI, in your view, can learn to be more empathetic, right? And perhaps in that sense, more human than human beings if exposed to the same data. What are your thoughts there?
I think it's an interesting question. I would never think that an algorithm could be more empathetic than a human, because I don't think there's a capacity to think in context the way that we as humans do. On the other hand, I think that an algorithm can take into consideration more facts, perhaps, than a human being, but I don't think that we can understand algorithms as making sense of those facts without human beings. Um, and that's a different and far more complex question, right? So are we capable as humans of creating sort of a standardized way of being empathetic? I don't know. Like, I think empathy is a thing that happens in context, and I'm not sure that an algorithm can sort of achieve that in a better way than a human being. But I don't think that empathy is sort of the reason why people want to use algorithms, at least in the criminal justice system. I think it has more to do with the first point you were making, which is about the pursuit of objectivity and the hope that we can remove bias that we worry appears in various different decision making contexts. That is different to me than empathy.
Is it fair to then follow up and ask you about the old idea in computing of garbage in, garbage out? In other words, there's been a lot of writing and a lot of focus in the computer world about the role of human beings in writing code. Do you see in sentencing opportunities for coders, for people that write this technology, to rethink their own biases, their own perspectives in these weighty and weighting issues that occur in AI and algorithmic decision making?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities for people who develop algorithms. and I have written in the past about my hope that people who are actually impacted by algorithms will be, part of those conversations, large parts of those conversations. But I think that there are opportunities to design algorithms differently, and certainly in ways that can be cognizant of or engage with certain assumptions about sort of the way the world works that are reflected in the algorithms and can lead to problematic outcomes. So to make that concrete, you can think in the sentencing context. I've written in the past about how most of the algorithms that we use that in the sentencing context are used to predict particular outcomes, what are defined as recidivism, which can mean many things, but basically the reoccurrence of criminal behavior by an individual. A lot of these algorithms rely on arrest data, and we know there's a lot of studies. Certainly, when you think about the recent protests around the killing of George Floyd and other sort of racial justice matters that have brought to the fore what we already know, which is that arrests are racially sort of distributed, that policing is something that in this country is very much influenced by race and class, so that two individuals might engage in the same behavior and only one is going to get an arrest and the other is not. That arrest becomes part of the data on which the algorithms are being designed. So to this question that Dave raised, are there ways that we might think about building an algorithm that can reduce bias? A simple example is, being reflective of when and why we use arrest data at all. And in the context that I write in the sentencing context, there are states that have prohibited the consideration of arrest records at sentencing. And yet the algorithms that they're relying on are almost exclusively developed with arrest data because that's cheap and easy to access. So, this is a really simple, sort of low-hanging fruit of this larger point, which is to say, we are all empowered, I think, to be critical about algorithms, and the people who make algorithms used for these different spaces can really be critical of the kind of data they choose as one step in really rethinking sort of the role of the algorithm and the perception that I think Dave, rightly sort of highlights, that the algorithm is somehow more objective, and so perhaps even more empathetic or preferred to a human being.
We're chatting with Professor Jessica Eaglin of Indiana University Bloomington Law on the Hearsay Culture Network's R&D with D&D. Denise.
Hi. So I'd love to take a step back for a minute. I'm imagining that there are people listening who are pretty surprised to learn that there's any role at all in the criminal sentencing universe for artificial intelligence. Maybe you could describe for us, Jessica, just again, sorry to do this to you. I know it's such a huge topic, but as briefly as you could, the nutshell version of, how we should think about sentencing traditionally and how it's operated, and the role AI is playing in it now and how that's altering the traditional framework.
Thanks, Denise. So I think it's such an important question. Briefly, when you think about sentencing, when I talk about sentencing, I'm thinking of the post-conviction context, where an individual has already been convicted of a crime, or in the context Dave was referencing, more often, somebody has pled guilty to a crime, and now they are moving on to a determination of how they should be punished. That decision is usually made by a judge. The judge gets information about the individual's background, their history, and the offense on which they have been convicted, and determines, should this person be sent to jail? Should this person be put on, probation, which means, supervision in the community? Should this person be sent to prison for, 5 years, 2 years, whatever. Algorithms or predictive algorithms are being introduced into the post-conviction sentencing context as additional information that judges should take into consideration. So, in addition to their crime of conviction, there is an algorithm that's run. There's information that's collected by court administrators to provide information to the judge about whether or not this person is a low risk, medium risk, or high risk of engaging in certain behavior in the future. That behavior could be anything from whether they are likely to be rearrested to whether they are likely to commit a violent crime in the future. And that is being run. That's where the algorithm is coming in. So it's this supplemental information for a judge to take into consideration at sentencing.
So there's no discretion, as far as you know, right now in U.S. jurisprudence for some artificially intelligent agent to be making unilateral determinations about somebody's post-conviction experience.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, that's relieving.
Not cutting the human out altogether. But I think that we should understand this development in a historical context where we have increasingly created sort of criteria. And I was going to say another context that you hear about algorithms a lot that is considered sentencing is in the pretrial bail context. So where a judge would decide this person has a charge has been brought against them. They're not going to trial for several months, and should this person be released into the community to wait for trial at home, or should this person be held, in a jail until trial occurs, right? So that's another context, and in that context, the algorithm provides information to the judge that says, this person is medium, low, high risk of engaging in certain behavior in the future, which might be failure to appear at court, right? Like you might release them and they won't come back. It might also be to engage in particular behavior, just as I said before, likely to be rearrested, etc. In both of these contexts, as far as I know, people are not replacing the judge, but we have been increasingly moving for decades. We've been moving in the direction of creating more and more criteria for a judge to consider in this determination. And particularly in the post-conviction sentencing context that I have used or have studied, there has been an effort at the federal level to basically reduce the discretion, increasingly reduce the discretion that judges have to decide an outcome independent of the algorithm.
So with that in mind, what you're describing is really an increasing reliance on these kinds of tools, and one that seems like it will only get even more expansive. Do you personally have a guiding principle for using AI in the criminal justice context?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the history of the federal sentencing guidelines in particular, which is where we have started to move the furthest in the direction of adding or reducing discretion, it really hasn't worked out to our benefit. We are now talking in this moment where there's broad awareness to the expansive increase in our incarcerated population. And in the federal system, the increase in the population and the incarcerated population did not happen solely because of the introduction of these stringent criteria, but it did not help, right? So we have been moving in this direction of an exponential increase in the federal incarcerated population, and there's been a stabilization in recent years, but the sort of curtailing of discretion, preventing people from considering the social context in which these individuals are coming to the courtroom has not been a sort of net good, right? And I think this goes back to where we started with Dave referencing this, the predictor for the flash fires, right? Which is to say, AI is not a ubiquitous good or bad in any one context, but we do need to think very critically about the context in which we are employing it. And at least in the sentencing context, I think there's a lot of reason to be skeptical.
Jessica, let's dig a little deeper here, because the role of the human, right, is central in our discussion. And I'm reminded, as Denise and you were discussing this issue, I'm reminded of a few known examples of situations involving nuclear conflicts where it was the decision making of a human being looking at all the data that a computer might have concluded means World War III, and saying something's not right here, right? It doesn't look right, and I'm not going to press the button. There's a famous incident involving a Soviet colonel who apparently prevented World War III by ignoring all of the data and saying, I'm not going to hit the button, and turned out to be right. You wrote an article a few years ago called "Technologically Distorted Conceptions of Justice," and it's I think a really useful article to drill down on what you and Denise were just discussing. You wrote that sentencing technologies subtly change key social concepts that shape punishment and society, and you focus in this article on three particular aspects: rehabilitation, to which we've referred a little bit today, racial equality, which we've also referred to a little bit, but something that we haven't discussed explicitly, what you call dangerousness. For the non-lawyer, even though we are all lawyers, right? And two of us are law professors. For the non-lawyer, can you unpack that a little bit for us? What do you mean by distorting conceptions of punishment, in particular, as it relates to these three critical concepts in the technological space?
Sure. And thank you for referencing this work. It came out with the Washington University Law Review in 2019, and it was great working with them. So thank you for referencing that. So the idea behind this is to say, like, we have this drift. These social concepts, they mean what we give them meaning in society, right? So what does rehabilitation mean to us? Is it the idea that we are managing individual, individual inadequacies or individual characteristics to reintegrate somebody into society? Or does it just mean sort of putting people on surveillance and making sure that they don't engage in criminal behavior again? Very nuanced distinctions, right? They sound very similar, but the social meaning of them, I argue in that paper, has been drifting as we continue to introduce technologies, in particular these sort of precursors to the artificial intelligence algorithms that we're talking about today, where what we think we care about is actually changing based on what we actually can measure. And I certainly talk about that in the context of sort of racial justice, sort of saying, look, our idea of what does it mean to have sort of, what does racial inequality mean in criminal laws administration, is shifting as we have more technological sort of infrastructure to say the thing we care about is treating different people differently instead of caring about sort of the social context in which, for example, people are coming to the criminal legal apparatus. So like the larger that our sort of criminal laws administration gets as in society, it's these algorithms and other sort of technologies make it seem normal that we only care about a certain kind of question in the context of racial justice. And then to this last point about dangerousness, in that context, I say, we have this idea that basically what we care about is dangerousness, but dangerousness is a social concept. And so I argue, are moving towards saying that what is dangerous are the things that we can measure, instead of accepting that it might be something else entirely. So again, using arrests, I think arrests are just a really great example, but you can do it with a lot of things. Do we think that somebody being arrested again in the future makes them by default dangerous? Well, it really shouldn't, because there are a lot of people who get arrested for things that are not dangerous, in the sense that we might understand dangerousness to be sort of imperiling somebody's, human body, right? Like you could be arrested for, you know, I mean, failure I mean, anyway, there are a lot of things that the criminal justice system sort of captures that don't necessarily accord with dangerousness. But the more we sort of resign ourselves to technology, we say, oh, the technology, the algorithm predicts this, that's what we care about. And basically the argument is saying we need to be critical about when and why we use algorithms, because they shape us as much as we shape them. So going back to this point we made earlier, you can imagine these questions, these normative questions that somebody building an algorithm is faced with, right? Like, for example, like what is it that we care about at sentencing? Should we be predicting arrest? Should we be predicting reconviction in or another conviction in 5 years or in 2 years, right? And part of what is going on is saying sort of, well, I've got the data that, for arrest, so arrest is what we care about. Right. And what I'm saying is, no, that's the wrong direction. Like we as humans need to be saying, what is it we care about? Can technology help us with that? Instead of technologists, right, saying, here's what we can give to you. Can you use it? And I think that this actually goes back to a point that Denise made much earlier in our conversation as well, which is sort of, we need to have, like, when you think about an ethics of AI, there also needs to be sort of an empowering of the human and saying, I don't want to just float along with technology. I think about the world I want first, and then think about what technology can do to help me get there.
Are there calculations or predictions that AI is making that human beings prior to the advent of this technology weren't? In other words, the things that you're describing, right, if I push back a little bit, are the kinds of things that people have thought about since time immemorial, I think, with regard to sentencing, right? Is this person likely to, commit another crime? Is this person a danger to society? Things like that. So is AI adding, or, and I understand your argument that it's kind of emphasizing that which we can measure, but I'm curious whether AI is adding measurements or adding analysis that previously didn't exist, or whether we're just substituting, right, AI or technology for decisions that were previously made by humans.
Yeah, I mean, so I think in the post-conviction sentencing context, I think this is the easy answer is like, no, we don't only care about those factors, right? So post-conviction sentencing, we also care about whether this person deserves, however you want to define deservedness, right? But do they deserve a punishment of a certain amount or a certain period of time? And that was actually an animating ethos for a long period of time. And again, I think this is also why it's important to say, like, our idea of what we care about keeps changing. Like rehabilitation, which I think people normatively say is a good thing, is not some stable concept. It doesn't mean one thing in one period of time. And so as we sort of change and we understand society to be quite different, those social concepts change as well. And so in one sense, you say, well, haven't we always cared about sort of predicting if somebody is likely to be successful in reintegrating into society, right? Yeah, of course. That is actually what decision makers have been doing for quite a while. But did we always understand that to be rehabilitation? Not necessarily.
So I'd like to have us wrap this up by getting a little sci-fi scary here at the end of the show. And maybe we can tie it in with convictions and sentencing and what we've been discussing, because I think this is all relevant to those topics, but also relevant to just humanity's interactions with AI going forward in general. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this aspect of AI scholarship, since you are a scholar who works in this area. What I'm particularly thinking about are people like James Barrett, who has written a book called Our Final Invention, and people like Nick Bostrom, who back in 2014 posited the famous paperclip problem, which is what happens when you give a sufficiently super intelligent artificial intelligence a problem to solve, and it proceeds to do so to the exclusion of all else, including, in this particular example, the survival of humanity and ultimately the entire universe. So I'm just wondering what you think about those sorts of dire predictions about the potential for AI to spin out of control, and think of us in ways that, we don't hate things like ants, but they don't get in our way when we need to accomplish other tasks. And what's your take on that, Jessica?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you can take to it's sort of like a techno-determinist approach, right? Which is to say, like, oh, the technology is developing and we humans are just going to sort of kick back and let it drive us right into, hell, basically. And yeah, I think that there is a component of that, my own research and many others are pushing back against, right? Saying, like, we've got to be critical, we have to be skeptical, and sometimes that's the harder thing to do. I'm optimistic, maybe, irrationally so, but I'm optimistic that we also are, we are not just going to sit here and watch technology sweep over and do nothing about it. We're more in a phase of adjustment. And that is, that means our legal frameworks are going to be changing, that our social sort of concepts that as we were just talking about are going to be changing. And so we're going to start to be critical of things we weren't critical of before. We'll start to be less critical of things we used to be critical of before. And so it is my hope that, that we are just in this moment of transition. And in this moment of transition, it looks like we could be, heading towards these sort of perilous ends that you're sort of alluding to from other scholars, but that as we start to see the perils as the work of policymakers and I'd like to think law scholars, but lawyers and others are doing, we won't just resign to that world any more than we did with sort of other forms of technological transformation that have happened in earlier, generations. So that, I think that, at the same time, what I thought you were going to ask me about is Minority Report, which is perhaps one of my favorite movies and books. And I do think that, that we are seeing these massive changes that could bring quite a bit of peril to our lives if we don't wake up and start empowering sort of the human to think about what we do in relation to technology.
Right. I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, do you really think that that's the direction that we're heading, that at some point people will be called out and culled out because of their likelihood to commit crimes?
I'd like to think that we're not. I think we're further from that than, certainly than the predictions from that book suggest, right? But I do think that if we don't start to resist sort of the pull of sort of the comfort of technologies, that yeah, we could end up in a context where, we are very comfortable. And that's the thing that scares me more is that we're comfortable with what those technologies would do. And we're not critical of them. We're not skeptical, and we don't think that we as humans bring anything to bear that a technology cannot do.
Isn't that? I mean, now I'm going to follow in Denise's dystopian questioning before we get to a slightly different style of questioning as we close, right? I mean, it's hard. I have to admit, Jessica, it's hard for me to envision in 2022 that we as a society have the capacity to really make these decisions in light of the fact that we're having a hard time, quite frankly, making decisions about things where there is broad scientific consensus. So without getting into the weeds of those issues, I'm going to ask you that question. I certainly agree that these discussions and decisions should be happening, but do you think they will? And if you think they can, how?
Oh, isn't that the $1,000,000 question? I mean, I spend a lot of time writing about it. I'm not sure that there's a single answer to it. And, I think that um, I'm optimistic that some of these conversations will happen and can happen. I also, as a law professor, have to believe that some of the laws have to change to facilitate that, right? Like we are in a place where we need to empower people to engage with the technologies, and we're also in a context where the law has been designed to facilitate non-engagement. And so I do think a starting point is sort of reimagining. So it's sort of this twofold thing. Like we have to reimagine our relationship to technology, but we also need sort of our institutions to help us to move in that direction by making us engage with the things we should be focusing on. And I do think that there's a lot of room for transformation on that front.
Well, it is optimistic to say that there's plenty of room for improvement. And the fact that we have room, I guess, is a good thing, because we could be locked in the proverbial black box, not only of knowledge, but of the ability to do anything about it. Jessica,
before we get to the speed round, I just want to say I think it's so important, based on what we're hitting on here, that education and conversations about these topics, like the one we're having here today, continue, because we've already seen in the last couple of years how our lawmakers grasp or fail to grasp tools as simple as social media, when we expect them to wrap their heads around artificial intelligence and its ramifications and dangers and biases. They've got a big learning curve. Let's help them out.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully R&D with D&D can help do that.
Hopefully.
The Hearsay Culture Network. All right. Jessica, thank you for permitting us that. We have a few more questions for you that we're calling speed round questions. And literally now, and again, as a law professor, I'm going to say to you, this is unfair, because what we're asking you to do, a fellow academic, is give a short answer to a question. I'm terrible at it. It's part of why I do these interviews. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask you, Denise and I are going to trade off 6 questions. We want, and if it'd be great to have a 1-word answer, but and a maximum 1 sentence. So I'm going to start us off. What is the best technology in your view?
In my field or in my view?
In your view, the world of technology, the best tech.
Oh gosh, I don't know. Maybe the phone.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good answer. Don't feel embarrassed about that. You're sitting there looking cringy. Yes, there are no bad answers, we should say. How about the worst tech?
I don't know. The algorithm.
Well, it's good that you're studying in that area then.
The best nonfiction book that you've read in the last 20 years.
Oh, that's hard. So, today I'm going to say Racial Formation in the United States, which is, I mean, that's a very academic book. So, but that's, ask me tomorrow, I'll have a different answer.
Yeah.
Give a shout out to the author.
Oh, what is it? Charles Omi, and it's Omi and Wynot. What are their first names? Michael Omi and Howard Wynot.
And that was Racial Formation in the United States?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Putting it on my list. Okay. Do you have an Echo device in your home?
No.
In-person or remote meetings?
Ooh, meetings?
Meetings.
Virtual.
Good.
In person.
Yeah. No, I'm with you.
Who's the most influential innovator today, in your opinion?
Ruha Benjamin.
Explain for people who have not heard of Ruha Benjamin.
So she's a scholar at Princeton, and she writes about racial justice and technology. And she has a book called I think it's Virtual Abolition, that's coming out in, I think, a few months. Anyway, but she's a really wonderful sort of critical thinker at the intersection of law, society, technology, racial justice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those answers. I know it's a little painful.
I know. Where are the notes? I want the notes in advance next time. So I'm my short answer.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
we don't throw these questions in advance. That's part of that's part of the fun of it. But like I said, Jessica, you have my sympathy. It's totally unfair to do that to a law professor. Jessica Eaglin, professor at Indiana Law Bloomington, expert on artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision making. Thank you so much for joining us today on R&D and D&D on the Hearsay Culture Network. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
So nice chatting with you, Jessica. We really appreciate your time and your insights.